Donald Trump's New World Order. What does it mean for you? Sounds like a dystopian nightmare. Well, to unpick what Trump has been up to and how it's impacting us globally, I'm delighted to be joined by Victor Hill, the financial economist. You can read his bio on the Master Investor Show website and meet him in the show on March the 29th. But I'm delighted that before that, he's put his head above the parapet and has come out of the bunker to join us now. So Trump is back, Victor. He's declared on the war on the world order. No more, Mr.
Well, indeed. Good morning, Sarah. And it seems like the world has changed quite profoundly since last we met. So the big guy is back. Trump is back, but this time no more Mr. Nice Guy. He has upset the apple cart in so many different ways. Should we be scared? Probably. Let's just take a step back and work out where we are because the situation is changing so rapidly, and every morning one wakes up to the news agenda, which is set broadly by Trump or one of his acolytes. So Keir Starmer met with President Trump in the Oval Office on 27th of February. And generally speaking, according to the media, it all went very well, and Starmer was acclaimed for his smooth handling of this rather capricious president. And it seemed like the special relationship was back in business, and it was business as usual to some degree. The very next day, as you will recall, Mr. Zelensky arrived in the Oval Office and got a dressing down from both Donald Trump and the Vice President, J.D. Vance. And it was all a pretty ugly affair, in my view, and in that of many. This was premeditated bullying. And poor old Zelensky was sent away with a clip in his ear, and the proposed mineral deal to give the US access to these rare earth metals, which supposedly reside under the ground in Ukraine, was not signed. And then the Europeans got together. Starmer reacted very swiftly with Macron, and they put together a conference in London, attended by all the main leaders, including Justin Trudeau and all the Europeans. And they have put forward this idea of the coalition of the willing. A very unfortunate title, in my view, because that is exactly the term that was used by George W. Bush back in 2003 for the alliance that was used to attack and invade Saddam Hussein's Iraq, with all kinds of unforeseen consequences. So what this coalition of the willing is going to do, and it's a coalition by definition which excludes the United States, is still very uncertain. But diplomatic meetings are proceeding apace, and indeed there's going to be one later this week, whereby the Europeans will consider the possibility of putting troops on the ground in Ukraine as peacekeepers. Now, why has Trump and his people turned on poor old Zelensky, who is generally regarded in Western Europe as a bit of a hero? He's certainly a very courageous man, whatever you may think of him personally. Basically, they perceive that he is not willing to come to the table and to talk peace with Russia. So therefore, they have put the pressure on him to change tack. And in the first instance, last week, that meant withdrawing new supplies of weaponry, and then withdrawing intelligence information. And now it even appears that the F-16s, which are flown by the Ukrainian Air Force, are no longer receiving software updates, albeit that apparently that's going to change later today. So the whole situation is changing all the time. As we speak, this is 11th of March in the morning, we know that Zelensky has turned up in Saudi Arabia. Why Saudi Arabia has become the sort of the crucible of peacemaking is something we can discuss, but there's something going on there in terms of Trump's relations with Mohammed bin Salman, of the acting regent of Saudi Arabia. We know that he's going to talk with the Americans, but not with the Russians. We know meetings took place 10 days ago in Saudi between the Americans and the Russians for the first time. Trump has had quite harsh things to say about Zelensky, but so far nothing negative to say about his old friend Vladimir Putin of Russia. So the fear is that the Americans have actually not only intervened to stop the war, but they have changed sides. And the Europeans, for their part, are still adamantly pro-Ukraine. This is unprecedented. We are in new territory, unknown territory.
The bang goes the Nobel Peace Prize that you and I thought Trump was chasing, particularly with the United Arab Emirates coming in and
Well,
getting involved as
bang goes the royal visit, perhaps. I don't know, the state visit.
the art of diplomacy. I think because we've given the invite, I think it would be rude of us to retract it. But I'm just wondering what Trump is playing at in terms of his friendship with his old friend Putin, and will Starmer remain the Trump whisperer?
Well, this is the question. It's very difficult to know exactly what is driving this, but it seems to be the case that Trump and Putin do have something in common, which is that they want to upend the world order that came into being back in 1945. This was at the end of the Second World War, the victory over Nazi Germany, May 1945, the 80th anniversary of which we shall be celebrating in a month or two. And I think that's going to be a very significant milestone. If you look at the history of the last 80 years, you had a period from 1945 to really 1990, in fact, just before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where there was a duopoly, a dual power structure, a Cold War, led on the one hand by the United States and on the other by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union effectively left the picture. It collapsed, leaving the US for a period of approximately 25 years as the sole hegemon, the hegemonic power, the sole superpower. And that lasted roughly until 2015. What happened in 2015? Well, there were a number of strands which came together, but most importantly, surrounding the rise of China and the emergence of China as a military superpower in its own right, with naval operations in the South China Sea. There was also the humiliation of the Obama administration over its failure to enforce the red lines that it had imposed in Syria, in the Syrian civil war, and the advance of Russian influence in Syria at that time. And who arises as a presidential candidate in 2015 for the first time but one, Donald Trump, on this campaign of this mantra of "Make America Great Again." Now, the thing is, look at "Make America Great Again" is a phrase that implies that America was once great and is no longer great. And that is what the Trumpists perceive, that America is on the back foot. So the first thing we should say about MAGA and Trump too is that it's a defensive stunt. Trump is actually aware that America's relative dominance is weakening in the world, and he has to take action to determine that America can remain the prime power, the most powerful superpower, well, probably for the rest of this century, if not longer. So one possible strategy that is in play here is to decouple Russia from its reliance on China. Now, remember, Russia and China are, what do they call it? The limitless friends, the friendship without limits, as they announced just before Ukraine was invaded. This was at a speech at the February 22 Winter Olympics in Beijing. What does Beijing bring to the party? Well, Beijing supplies all of Russia's industry. Basically, most cars on the road in Russia now are manufactured in China. Pretty much all of its laptops are manufactured in China. What does Russia supply? Hydrocarbons, gas and oil. And by the way, the amount of gas it can supply is actually, there's a bottleneck there in terms of there still only being one pipeline connecting Russia with China, which runs through Mongolia. So in that relationship, Russia is very much the junior partner. So historically speaking, there's a parallel to this, which is that back in 1972, Richard Nixon engineered this détente with China, which was then the junior partner of Russia, in order to try to exert some influence over it and to weaken Russia's grip on China. And this is now happening effectively in reverse. There's something else in play, which is that the world order of 1945 was based on the UN and this concept of international law. And there are reasons to suppose that Trump wants to go back to a pre-1945 states system, which is basically where great powers bargained with one another and allowed each other spheres of influence in which they could operate. And effectively, this was backed up by, the tacit threat of military conflict in the end. And all of Europe was organized on this principle throughout the 19th century, the concert of Europe, where the great powers basically determined, what the small powers would be able to do, and each had their spheres of influence. And it is evident that Trump regards Ukraine as very much being in Russia's sphere of influence. And of course, the Russians, or some Russians, many Russians possibly, believe that Ukraine is a part of Russia. It doesn't exist as a separate entity. It is naturally part of, the motherland. So, this leaves the Western Europeans, the EU and Britain and others, including Canada, in a very exposed position. Can I just say something about the so-called special relationship?
Are you talking about Mr. Starmer, the Whisperer?
Yeah, the Trump Whisperer. Well, Starmer is doing his best to keep cordial relations, quite naturally, because, to be honest, we don't really have much leverage over the United States. The so-called special relationship between the UK and the USA is a largely sentimental idea, because of course it's true that there are millions of us in this country who love America and who visit it frequently and who love Americans, and vice versa. There are lots of Americans who love us. But at the level of states, the relationship between the two nations, really since independence, and particularly since the War of 1812, has always been entirely transactional. So that, at the beginning of the Second World War, the Americans were asked to assist the British Empire, and they were prepared to do so, but only if all of the gold from South Africa was shipped over to the USA, and only so long as Lend-Lease, vastly benefited America's strategic interests. And indeed, most of the so-called aid that America gave to the UK in World War II of a financial kind was in the form of loans, which were only finally repaid and into 2005 under the Blair government. So let's not be too sentimental about that relationship. It's always been very hard-nosed. If there is a special relationship, it has been between the USA and its northern neighbor, Canada. And, just the border between Alaska and Canada is one of the longest land borders in the world. And if you incorporate that, huge border from really Seattle to the Great Lakes, that's the longest land border in the world. And it's entirely undefended, which is an extraordinary thing, if you think about it. Now, the Canadians always assumed that the US would be their kindly giant neighbor and would, always, treat them with respect. And that's now breaking down, because Trump is giving Canada a very hard time in terms of tariffs and making threatening noises about making Canada the 51st state. And there are even reports that the US Department of Trade is going to insist on border changes. This is like some of the islands in the Great Lakes to America's advantage. So it's not surprising that the new Canadian Prime Minister, Carney, has launched himself as of yesterday on a platform of defending Canada's interests against its giant southern neighbor.
And in terms of spheres of influence and new faces on the political agenda, what about Germany? Because we've got the Merz government, there's talks of a debt orgy, a splurge on European defence. Is he going to make his mark in a large way?
Good question. I mean, one of the biggest geopolitical factors that has emerged since we last spoke at the German elections of 23rd of February produced some just shy of 30% in favor of the CDU CSU. This is the right of centre analogue to the British Tories, led by Friedrich Merz. Merz himself is a very impressive character. He speaks fluent English. He's worked in private equity. He's a corporate lawyer. He has very pro-business sentiments. But he has picked up this whole theme of the need for Europe to rearm, along with Macron and Starmer. And he has already pledged that once he is in power, which should take place before Easter, all things being equal, probably in a coalition with the SPD, the left of centre party, which lost the election, he will increase military expenditure. And in order to do that, he will have to bend or change or reform some of Germany's fiscal rules, of which there is this Schwarze Null rule, which basically means that the Germans have to balance their fiscal budget every year. And he is saying, well, we can accept defense expenditure or investment in defense equipment from this fiscal balance. There's another rule, the so-called debt brake, which is also likely to be subject to amendment. So there is the prospect that Germany will emerge as a significant military player in Europe in concert with France, which is already a nuclear power, and of course with the UK, which is a military power and a nuclear one. How that will pan out, will be the subject of numerous discussions going forward, but it's going to take time. I mean, to get the European defense establishment up to the required strength they would need to offer a credible defense against any potential Russian aggression without American help, that's going to take anything up to 10 years. And we don't really have the time.
It's so much like that game in the 70s I used to play with my brother, the game of Risk, La Conquête
Yes.
du Monde. And I'm just thinking,
I used to play that.
I think I'm going to get it out of the cupboard and start to play it because that's going to inform some of my podcast agendas. But I want to talk about the trade tariffs because you and I are talking on Tuesday, March the 11th, Monday, the 10th of March. We saw the Trump bump in the US markets become the Trump slump. Is it all down to fear over those trade tariffs?
Well, there's absolutely no question that the markets are nervy, and indeed the money men are getting more and more nervous. And you will have seen that yesterday Goldman Sachs downgraded its growth forecast for the USA from something like 2.4 to 1.7, which is still much better than the UK, but that's the second time that it's been downgraded. Now, there is also inflation is persistent within the system. And it's evident that slapping tariffs on food imports from China and Mexico and Canada is going to increase the cost of the American consumer's shopping basket. So you will have more inflation coming through the system, and that will have a downward impact on living standards. So, that may already be represented in some of the opinion polls, which suggest that Trump is not as popular as he was a month or so ago, or in January, just after he was inaugurated. What the MAGA people will tell you as a counter argument to that is that tariffs will generate huge revenues for the federal government, which will obviously be used to reduce the fiscal deficit, and that in turn will permit more rapid and significant cuts in interest rates going forward. So that they say there are compensating virtues to this. They also will point to the fact that a number of large manufacturing companies are already talking about reshoring manufacturing operations to the USA. And one example of that is Honda, the Japanese automotive giant, which has already announced that it will manufacture the new generation of its Civic model, not in Mexico as previously planned, but in the USA. So that means, real jobs, as Trump would say, coming back to America.
Someone who isn't as popular as he was a month ago is Elon Musk. And I use popular in the loosest of ways because, quite frankly, I find him irritating. But what is he up to and how much influence do you think he has now? Because I can imagine two
Hmm.
big personalities, him and Trump. I can imagine Trump will sideline him as he has done with other sort of lieutenants in previous
Yes.
administrations.
Well, what an interesting question. I mean, like him or loathe him, Trump is a fascinating figure, who has emerged as one of the key, really one of the three main people in the Trump administration, apart from the president, the vice president, and there is Musk, who technically is not a minister. He's not a secretary of state, and yet he attends cabinet meetings, and yet he appears to be making, hugely consequential executive decisions. Now, the way I read this, and this is really my own angle, just by piecing together interesting things that come across my desk when we look in the context of the emergence of artificial intelligence and military technology. Musk is absolutely at the center of these new developments, and it appears that there are people in the MAGA movement who regard Musk as being the key architect of driving artificial intelligence, and moreover, that AI will probably supersede human intelligence and intellectual ability as early as 2026. So next year, and this is the so-called singularity, where thinking machine. I don't think it's going to happen, but we could discuss that elsewhere. I don't think machines are intelligent in any philosophically meaningful sense, but they are extremely impressive, and you can get them to make decisions. So there's absolutely no doubt that something quite phenomenal is emerging in that space. Now, these people also believe that once you get viable AI, the entire process of scientific research is going to be accelerated massively, and that we will be able to make huge advances in terms of nuclear fission, medical technology and treatment, pharmacology, and indeed in terms of quantum computing, because you need AI to design chips, microchips that will run quantum computers. So this is all mind-boggling stuff. There's a second aspect where Trump is critical, and that is in terms of his ownership and his control of SpaceX. SpaceX, the rocket company, which also controls the Starlink satellite constellation, which is strategically vital to the Ukrainians in prosecuting their war with Russia. And he's basically threatened to turn that off, provoking a Twitter spat with the Polish foreign minister the day before yesterday. So just consider that out of 250 rockets launched from planet Earth last year, 2024, 102 out of 250 rockets launches, 145 were by SpaceX. They weren't all successful, but little by little, SpaceX is becoming the dominant aerospace and rocket manufacturing company in the world. British aerospace has increased in value very significantly given this surge in tech stocks, but we think that SpaceX is worth about 7 times the market valuation of British aerospace. And of course, that's the notional value because it's not actually it's not actually a listed company yet. And it will be interesting to see when Musk decides to list it. Now, these rockets could potentially be used, these reusable hypersonic rockets, to deploy armies almost anywhere in the world within an hour or two. So there are huge military implications, as well as the exploration of the moon, the extraction of minerals from the moon, and in all kinds of other ways in terms of technology. So Musk sits absolutely at the center of this technological revolution, and Trump wants to make sure that he is on side. Um, that is not going to be easy because there have already been ructions apparently between Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Elon Musk. He's probably not a very easy person to work with, Sarah, not like you and me.
Yes, and I'm quite sure you can't be replicated. I can't imagine that Victor Hill will appear as a hologram on the Master Quest shows or on the podcast. But you mentioned cabinet then. I a lot of people are concerned that Trump is making executive orders without guidance. He's doing it autonomously. Who who is advising Trump? Is there a cabinet as we understand it in the UK?
Well, Trump is an interesting character, whatever you think of him, but he's not a very bookish man. He doesn't seem to have read very widely, and yet he seems to have very keen instincts on most things. So it would be foolish to underestimate the man. But it does seem to me, and from what I have observed and read, that the chess player behind him is JD Vance, the vice president, who is undoubtedly a highly intelligent individual, who's also a good writer, by the way, but who has, long-term strategic thinking at the heart of what he's saying. And the word is that, obviously Trump will have to step down in 4 years, and JD Vance is already being referred to in Washington circles as number 48, in other words, the 48th president. So it is likely that if Musk succeeds and if Trump succeeds and maintains his popularity, Vance will be the next president. The Democrats at the moment are looking very weak, but obviously anything can happen in 4 years, so things could very well change. Who would be JD Vance's vice president in 2029? Believe it or not, according to the commentator Henry Cole, it's likely to be Donald Jr. So keep it in the family, Sarah.
Goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. Right, we are running out of time, but a couple of minutes, please. Home territory, back to Blighty, because
Yeah,
Starmer has risen in stature in recent weeks. But
he has, yes.
you were suggesting to me before we recorded this that he's approaching a period of extreme danger, which will make or break him. What do you mean by that?
I think so. It's quite normal that when you have a situation of heightening international tension, that the leader in question suffers a temporary increase in their popularity. And to give him his due, Starmer has handled the situation very deftly and has shown great diplomatic resources, and particularly his handling of the Europeans, and who finally seem to have forgiven us for Brexit. The French were arguing about fishing rights as recently as January, when we were talking about a defence collaboration agreement. That's all gone out of the window, because now we're focused on trying to make Europe a credible defence establishment. However, supposing this coalition of the willing deploys troops to Ukraine, and supposing they come under fire, God forbid, and supposing fire is exchanged with the Russians, well, you've got a potential war with Russia on your hands, and the Americans are sitting back and saying, "Well, I told you so. It wasn't a good idea." So the situation could become extremely dangerous very quickly. In which case, I doubt if his popularity would be sustained. And then there's a second reason, apart from foreign affairs. on the domestic front, we've already seen that Starmer, in my view, courageously has cut the foreign aid budget in order to divert those resources towards defense so that we can claim that we're spending 2.5% of GDP on defense. Well, yeah, the money hasn't actually gone through yet. And prospectively, by 2030, that figure will have risen to 3% of GDP. Well, that's all well and good. But that is highly controversial within the left wing of the Labour Party. The Corbynistas decry that as being, a betrayal of the poor and so forth. But even more than that, what we now know is that our crippling benefits budget, welfare program, is going to have to be cut back. And that is going to be extremely controversial. Just consider that we spend more on disability benefits at £66 billion per year than we do on defence expenditure at £57 billion per year. So I think announcements of cuts, it could be in terms of personal disability payments and so forth, of people who are of working age, young people who are out of training and employment. These people are going to, feel the brunt of Ms. Reeves's, efforts to cut this expenditure, this program, and that will have political consequences. If Starmer can survive them beyond really the summer of this year, well, all well and good. He's got, a massive majority, which will take him through to the end of the Parliament in 2029. But be prepared for some political turbulence in the UK. I would also just like to add, in terms of the position of Miss Reeves as our Chancellor, our finance minister, I really think that unless the UK can demonstrate that its growth mojo is picking up, I feel that her own personal situation is in doubt. And ditto with Mr. Milliband, the Energy Secretary, where the climate of opinion has changed in terms of the tolerance for net zero and its impact on living standards.
I must admit, Rachel is looking a little bit tired. Now, one of our listeners, one Michael Bailey, has accused us of depressing him on our podcasts.
Oh,
So I'm going to give you one sentence to say something that will uplift your predictions, a lovely, juicy bit of intelligence that will leave us on a high.
okay. Well, Sarah, there's one member of the cabinet, and it's a pretty depressing lineup, in my view, who I think is trying to reform his department, and that is Wes Streeting, the Secretary for Health. And he has been talking in a very positive way, I think, about the application of artificial intelligence to healthcare. And I can foresee that it's within the realms of possibility, both technical and financial possibility, that within 5 years, by the end of this Parliament, each of us will have a healthcare account on our smartphones, and that they will be monitoring us in terms of changes in our main parameters of our health and our physical condition. It'll be voluntarily. It'll be voluntary. You can sign up to it if you wish. Obviously, people who don't want to participate will not be obliged to participate. But I think they will then use the data to harvest all kinds of positive interventions in terms of measuring the efficacy of medication and treatment and of monitoring healthcare in a far more proactive way. And I think that's all to the good.
Very good. And it'll be checking to see if you are slowly morphing into a hologram. Victor, I will see you in person March the 29th at the Master Investor Show.
I'm looking forward to it, Sarah.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us today. Take care.
Thanks again. Bye.